And we're good. Okay. So we're going to be in Daniel 6, probably the most famous chapter in Daniel, Daniel in the Lion's Den. So that is what we're going to talk about today. So if you were here last week, we talked about Daniel 5. And we went through King Belshazzar. Remember, we learned about King Belshazzar and the handwriting on the wall and the famous feast in which they feasted, trying to boost morale as the Persian and Mede soldiers were heading towards them to, take out Belshazzar and conquer Babylon. So Babylon is now conquered by the Medes and the Persians. And we found out at the very end of chapter 5 in verse 30, it says, "That very night Belshazzar the Chaldean king was killed, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old." Okay, so Darius is 62, okay, at this time, and he is actually the uncle of King Cyrus, okay? We learned a little bit about Cyrus last week. So Cyrus is kind of heading up the Medes and the Persians. They are cooperating together to work together to conquer. Okay, so King Cyrus is kind of a head over all of it, but his uncle is helping him, and he, because of his faithfulness at 62 years old, King Cyrus gives Darius Babylon, basically. He's like, here, you can take over Babylon. Okay, so let's pick up in verse 1 of chapter 6. And it says, "It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be throughout the whole kingdom, and over them 3 high officials, of whom Daniel was one, to whom these satraps should give an account, so the king might suffer no loss. Then this Daniel became distinguished above all the other high officials and satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom." Okay, so King Cyrus, he's out there conquering, right? So he conquers Babylon, and he gives it to King Darius. So King Darius, being a very wise man, he's a ruler, right? He's a general of this army. He goes in and he sets up 120 rulers. Okay, over the kingdom of Babylon. Babylon's huge at this time. It's not a little tiny city. It's a huge kingdom. So he sets up these 120 leaders, and then over them, he sets up 3 people, and Daniel is one of these 3 people. Okay, so obviously Daniel is still in a high position, because remember we talked about last time that he was probably kind of semi-retired. He's in his 80s, okay, so he's 80 plus. He's been around for a long time, but he's still active in the palace. And so Darius sets him up with 2 other men, okay? There's 3 of them all together to rule over this 120 who are ruling over Babylon, okay? So this is the hierarchy here. And it says that Darius was planning on promoting Daniel even above these 3 men. So he was going to promote Daniel to the top, basically right under himself. Okay, so this is what he planned on doing. And these men were not happy about that. Okay, remember, Daniel is a foreigner. He is from Israel. He is not Babylonian. Okay, and he's in his 80s. He is old. They don't want him to rule over them. Okay, so this happens a very short time after the events of chapter 5, because the only thing we know about Darius is that he only ruled for 2 years. Okay, so these events happen very, very quickly after the feast that we read about in chapter 5. Okay, other than that, we know nothing about Darius. Okay, we know that he was in his 60s and that he was a general, and he ruled over Babylon for 2 years, and that's it. That's all we know about this ruler. As opposed to Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar, we have all this history on them, and we only know very, very little about King Darius. Okay? So in the short time, Daniel just outshines these other 2 men, and Darius is planning on promoting him. Okay? So let's go ahead and read in verse 4. "Then the high officials and the satraps sought to find a ground for complaint against Daniel with regard to the kingdom." Okay? But they could find no ground for complaint or any fault, because he was faithful and no error or fault was found in him. Okay, so they're like, okay, we've got to find a way to get this Daniel guy not promoted above us. Okay, we got to find some kind of skeleton in his closet. We got to find some wrong that he's done that we can bring charges against him. We don't want him over us. Okay? Verse 5 says, "Then these men said, 'We shall not find any ground for complaint against this Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God.'" Okay? So they figured out that they were not going to be able to find anything politically wrong with Daniel. Okay? Daniel had very, very high integrity. He had no flaw in his character. Okay? Daniel has been serving Babylon for 65 years, and they cannot find one thing wrong. Okay, that is a testimony right there. He's been serving for 65 years. They couldn't find anything to bring against him. Okay? So it says that the only thing that they could find out was if they could find something in connection with the law of his God. Now that's a testimony again right there, because he's a foreigner living in Babylon, but they know and they have watched him for 65 years that he's going to be faithful to his God. So that's where they're going to lay the trap. Okay? Verse 6. "Then these high officials and these satraps came by agreement to the king and said, 'O King Darius, live forever. All the high officials of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the counselors and the governors, are agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an injunction that whoever makes a petition to any god or man for 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked.' Therefore King Darius signed the document and the injunction." Are they speaking truth? Is everybody in agreement? Do you think they asked Daniel?
No.
No. These 122 men might be in agreement, but Daniel probably wasn't consulted about this issue. Okay? They are telling the king that we're all in agreement that this needs to happen. So remember, he's a brand new king. Okay? He set up and established all this stuff, and they said, okay, for the next 30 days, we're going to see where your loyalties lie. We're going to have the whole kingdom bow down to you for the next 30 days. But there's a time frame there, just 30 days. And we're going to see if there's any sort of dissension among the ranks who are not going to bow down to you as the new king. Okay? So they are appealing to Darius's pride and also his need for unification. Because remember, he's older. He's answering to his nephew, King Cyrus. So if something starts happening in the kingdom of Babylon, it's on his head. Okay? So they're kind of picking and chinking at the armor here. Okay? So the enemies of Daniel knew what they needed to do. They needed to persuade the king in order to do this, to sign this edict. Okay? Now, when they had to establish it into law, it became binding so that no one could change it, not even the king. Now, you're going to hear this echo in Esther. Okay? If you know the story of Esther, Esther comes later and we're in the same area. Okay? We're in the same palace. We're in the same area. So this is an established thread all the way through these stories that once the king signs something in order, no one can change it, not even the king. Okay? So this is an established fact in the Pedo-Persian Empire. Okay? And they were supposed to be speaking on behalf of the gods. Okay? So if you serve a god who changes his mind all the time, people aren't going to really want to follow that god. Okay? So once something was signed in action, it could not be changed. Okay? All right, so verse 10 says, when Daniel knew about that document, that the document had been signed, he went to his house where he had windows in his upper chamber open toward Jerusalem. Okay, so remember, he's probably living close to the palace. He's probably living in a really swanky luxury apartment. Okay, so he goes upstairs when he finds out all of this stuff is happening. Right, he doesn't go to Darius. Okay, he goes to his house. And he goes all the way upstairs, and he's got windows facing toward where Jerusalem would be. Okay? And he opens up his windows, and he's going to pray. Okay? So he got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as he had done previously. Okay? So this is not something new to Daniel. Okay? So for 65 plus years, he's been doing this. Okay? Now remember, Daniel is one of 3 men who are over 120, who are over the whole area of Babylon. Okay, and he is almost getting ready to be promoted to second in command, and yet he still has time 3 times a day to go home and pray. Okay, he is a very busy man, and yet he still finds time every day to go home 3 times a day and to sit down and to kneel all the way down and to pray to his God. Okay, so he had done this previously. Verse 11. Then these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and pleading before his God. They found him exactly where they knew they were going to find him. Okay? So it was very obvious that he had been doing this long before this day. Okay? They knew exactly where to find him. He was going to be in his house praying, and they knew exactly what time he was going to be there. So this was his routine that he had done this. Okay? Then they came near and said before the king concerning the injunction, O king, did you not sign an injunction that anyone who makes petition to any god or man within 30 days except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? Okay? So they find Daniel right where he is, and they go to the king. And they said, didn't you just sign this? Right? Probably within hours. The ink's probably not even dry on the parchment yet. Didn't you just sign this? And look where Daniel is. You know? Look where Daniel is. So the king answered and said, the thing stands fast, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked. Then they answered and said before the king, Daniel is one of the exiles. They are not going to let Daniel forget where he came from, okay? He's been in Babylon a long time, okay? They're not going to forget. They're going to let him forget. Who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or the injunction you've signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day. Uh-oh. We're still twisting the truth just a little bit, aren't we? Okay? The whole pays attention there, they're basically saying he's mutinying against you. Okay? He doesn't pay attention to you. He doesn't respect you, king. Okay? Can you see how they're twisting King Darius here? Okay? These little tiny tests. Okay? Then the king, when he heard these words, was much distressed, and he set his mind to deliver Daniel. Okay? And he labored until the sun went down. To rescue him. He labored until the sun went down to rescue him. Then these men came by agreement to the king and said to the king, know, O king, that this is the law of the Medes and the Persians, that no injunction or ordinance that the king established can be changed. All right. So Daniel is in his room and he's praying. Okay. He finds out about this ordinance, this new law, and he goes and he does what he does every day. He goes and he prays. Okay. So he was in private prayer up in his bedroom facing Jerusalem, which means that he was not out in the open. He was not trying to impress anybody. He was not trying to openly rebel against the new law, okay? He prayed with his windows towards Jerusalem, remembering where he had come from, remembering the temple. That's what they were praying towards, the temple, even though there was no sacrifices going on at this time, okay? But he also prayed according to Scripture, because 1 Kings 8:30, Solomon asked God to give special notice to people when they prayed toward Jerusalem, okay? So this was a request of Solomon's, that whoever points themselves towards the temple, that you would hear their request and that you would grant it, okay? And he's down on his knees, okay? Imagine, I don't know how many of you in here are over 80, you know, but like, I'm 40, almost 40, and getting down on my knees is really difficult.
You're a baby.
But could you imagine 3 times a day as an 80-year-old man getting down and up, and down and up, right? That sacrifice of humility that he gets down.
Jen, do you mind saying that again about Solomon?
Solomon. So Solomon's request to God in 1 Kings 8:30, he asks God, any of your people who point towards the temple, that you would hear them and that you would grant the request. So it was a special type of prayer that if they were facing the temple in posturing, like physically had pointed themselves toward the temple wherever they were, that God would hear that request and grant it. So this was Solomon's request for his people. If we physically pay attention to your temple, hear our request and grant it. Right? Not that God wasn't hearing any other request, right? If you turned your back to the temple, God still could hear you. But this was Solomon's request for his people, that God would hear those specific requests. So Daniel, knowing this, he is facing Jerusalem, even though he is miles away from he can't even see it. But he knows, if I point this direction, I'm going to face the temple and God's going to hear me. Okay? It's a great question. And I love that Daniel takes time to give thanks. Okay? He's not just praying, right? He's not going to, God, just get me out of this, right? He's thanking God. He gives prayers of thanksgiving while this is going on. Okay? So they found him just where they knew Daniel would be. He's deep in prayer. Okay? He's pleading his cause. He's giving thanks. Okay? And it's admirable of Darius here. Okay? So when the king hears that Daniel's praying to his God, he's distressed. And he sets his mind to deliver Daniel. Okay? So we have a king who is showing some integrity here. Okay? He is not blaming Daniel. He is not blaming them for tricking him. He's saying, this one's on me. Okay? And I'm going to find a way to fix this. Okay? So then it says, he labored until the sun went down to rescue him. So that labor there is actually physical work. Okay, so he's probably pulling laws. He's probably getting his wise men and his counselors involved. He is actively working until the sun goes down to try to reverse this issue, to try to save Daniel. Okay, because he knew, according to the law, that the execution had to be fulfilled by sundown. Okay, so if you're found guilty, Daniel has no trial here. Okay, he broke the law. There's no trial. There's no anything evidence than the words of these men, and by sundown he has to be executed according to their law. Okay, so the king knows he's only got till sundown to figure something out, and he labors for hours trying to rescue Daniel. Okay, so then these men, okay, all 122 of them come together and they tell him, "Know, O king, that this is the law of the Medes and the Persians, that no injunction or ordinance that the king establishes can be changed." Okay? So this is their final stamp on all of this as the sun's going down. You know the law can't be changed. There is nothing you can do about it. Okay? There's absolutely nothing that you can do about it. So verse 16. Then the king commanded, and Daniel was brought and cast into the den of lions. Okay? The king doesn't have any other choice. He has to go through with this. Right? Because he knows what's going to happen to him if he doesn't do this. He's going to be the one charged of rebellion, right? And Cyrus is going to have no problem taking him off of his throne. So he has to follow through with this. So he calls Daniel and he casts him into the den of lions. But the king declared to Daniel, "May your God, whom you serve continually, deliver you." Okay? Darius is out of options. So he tells Daniel the only thing that he can tell him. "I have tried my best to save you, Daniel. There's nothing I can do. Hopefully your God will save you." Okay? Because he's your only option right now. "May your God, whom you serve continually, deliver you." And a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the lion of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet, with the signet of his lords, that nothing might be changed nothing changed concerning Daniel. Now this is a pretty interesting picture that we have here. Because what's probably happening is that the den is underground, okay? And people would have to be lowered down into it, right? You don't want a door on a lion's den, okay? So those lions are pretty powerful. They're just gonna come through a door, right? So you drop them down and they can't get up, okay? So people would have to be lifted down. Well, it's interesting that he calls for a stone to be put over it.
Well,
And then he
that's
goes,
what God can do to Daniel.
right, but he puts a stone over the mouth of the den, and then he goes a step further, and he puts a seal on it. And normally what would happen when they do this is they would take wax, and they would melt it down, and they would pour it on it, and then he would take his ring, signifying that he was the king and the one in charge, and he would push his ring into the wax and seal it. Right? Now this was done probably for a couple of reasons. This is actually protection on Daniel, because if these 122 men move that stone and go in there after Daniel, they're going to be charged and executed. Okay? So this is the king's seal on Daniel. that only God is going to decide his fate. That Darius is not going to decide his fate, that these guys aren't going to decide his fate. He is leaving it in the hands of Daniel's God. Okay? So he puts this seal of protection over it. But it's kind of interesting here, especially when we start getting to other chapters, you kind of hear this echoed in the Gospels, right? They put Jesus' body in a grave, in a den, which was carved out of stone, and then they rolled a stone over it, and then the Romans came along and they put a seal on it, and the seal wasn't to protect the dead body, right? He wasn't going anywhere. Okay? He was going to be in the hands of his God. It was to protect all these other people who were going to come along and steal the body and change the fate. Okay? So we see this echoed in the New Testament. It's an incredible picture of this king going, there's nothing more I can do, but my final act for you is to put a protection on you. Because if your God saves you and they find out about it, and they break that seal before I get back here, then I can charge them. Okay? So he's leaving this all in the hands of Daniel's God here. Alright, so verse 18. Then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, and sleep fled from him. So I really love that they tell us what happened to Darius here, right? Because we could have just had the stone rolled over, we could have had the seal, and now found out what happened to Darius. But we're told what King Darius does. He goes back to his palace, and he spends the night fasting, okay? He doesn't allow any food to be brought to him. He doesn't allow any other distractions to be brought to him. Okay, remember he's got a whole long list of concubines and everything else, right? He could have very easily distracted himself with everything that was going on, but he didn't. And sleep fled from him. Okay, so he didn't sleep the entire night long. Now, where's our Daniel?
In the lines.
Our Daniel's in the lion's den. He probably slept better than Darius. Okay, right? Darius is in his plush palace. He's got servants waiting on him hand and foot, and he's the one who spends all night awake. Okay? Meanwhile, Daniel, who's 80 years old, has been dropped into a hole and has lions all around him, right? He probably slept okay. All right? So, the king sealed it. He goes to his palace, and he's like, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do. We're going to see what happens in the morning. The only thing that we can wait for is this break of day. Okay? So we're in this darkness, and we're waiting for daybreak to hear all these echoes. Okay? In the story of Jesus, all of these echoes are waiting for daybreak. Now, our Daniel, he's in the lion's den, but the only thing Daniel has to do is the only thing Daniel's ever done. Daniel probably prayed, right? He probably snuggled up with those lions. Probably told him a bedtime story, right? Probably told him about Abraham and Adam and Isaac and Jacob. Probably, sang some psalms. There's a very interesting psalm that he might have sang. Psalm 22, verses 21 and 22, it says, "Save me from the mouth of the lions. You have rescued me from the thorns of the wild oxen." Nebuchadnezzar. "I will tell of your name to my brothers." Lions, gather around, we'll tell you about my Jesus. "In the midst of the congregation, I will praise you." Okay? It's a psalm that Daniel would have known that he probably sang because it was coming true before him. Okay? That these were the words of David. Okay? And he was probably telling these lions all about it. He had a captive audience. They weren't going anywhere, and he wasn't going anywhere. Okay? He was praising his God. And he takes a nap in the den of the lions. Then verse 19, then at the break of day, sunrise, right? You can just see Darius just waiting at his palace, just waiting for daylight to break over the horizon, okay? Daylight breaks, and the king arose, remember, because he's not sleeping, okay? So he can get up at the break of day, and he went in haste to the den of lions. He just gets up and runs to the den of lions, okay? And as he came near to the den where Daniel was, he cried out in a tone of anguish, okay? It is wrecking him to know what happened to Daniel. And absolutely wrecking this king. And the king declared to Daniel, "O Daniel, servant of the living living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the den of lions? So he asks the question into the darkness, Daniel, are you there, buddy? Has your God saved you? You know what his question is? He's expecting to hear yes. Okay? He's expecting, the way he's wording this question, to hear Daniel reply yes. Okay? Hey Daniel, are you there? Did your God deliver you? Then Daniel said to the king, O king, live forever. My God has sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him. And also before you, O king, I have done no harm. Okay? So he answers it. Could you imagine the weight that just peels off of Darius when he hears Daniel's voice? Okay? When he's the one who had to break that seal to see Daniel. And Daniel tells him that God has sent an angel. Okay? Now he doesn't know, we don't know if Daniel saw an actual angel. Okay? He just testifies that God intervened and snapped those lions' mouths shut. Okay? He tells him that an angel is the one standing between me and these lions and is keeping their mouths shut. Okay? And he also says that he did not break the law. Okay? He is found absolutely faultless in all of this. He did not go against the king. He did not go against the king's best interest. Okay? He is an example of obedient disobedience. Okay? An absolute perfect example of obedient disobedience. He was doing his own thing, worshiping his own God, okay? And God puts his stamp of approval on this, that yes, my Daniel was obedient, okay? And he preserves through faith, okay? Though he was already righteous and he was unjustly accused, those things could not protect him, okay? Only God could protect him in these circumstances. So verse 23 says, and then the king was exceedingly glad. I bet he was, right? He was exceedingly glad and commanded that Daniel be taken up out of the den. So let's bring him out, boys, bring him out. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no harm was found on him. Not a scratch is on this guy, okay? Not even a scratch. They didn't even try to attack him. Didn't try to swipe at him, nothing, okay? No kind of harm was found on him because he had trusted his God. And the king commanded those men who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought and cast into the den of lions. So we don't know how many of this 122 this was. Could have been all of them. We don't know. We don't know if it was the two. We don't know if it was 122. We have no idea. It just says that these men who had accused Daniel were brought and tossed into the lion's den. But it's interesting, the king points out that they maliciously accused him. So he's seeing motive here. He knew exactly why they did what they did. Okay? And then it says, they, their children, and their wives. Which sounds really harsh to us, right? These were innocents. They didn't have any part in all of this, right? But this is an absolute testimony to the history of the Persians. Because the history of the Persians, there was an ancient writer who wrote a Persian law, and he quotes as saying this, the laws among them are formidable, by which, on account of the guilty one, all the kindred perish. So if they were found guilty, their whole family was then executed. Okay? This was done to keep the integrity of the land. Okay? If you were found guilty, your whole family could have been responsible for your guilt. That speaks to the community keeping track of their people. Right? You're going to hold everyone accountable, because if you go down and I have to go down with you, I'm going to keep you accountable and you're going to keep me accountable. Okay? This was how they kept people in line. Okay? So it's an absolute testimony and confirmation of the history that the Persians meant business. Okay? And King Darius knew this. So he throws them all in and their families in. And before they reached the bottom of the den, they're falling. Before they reached the bottom of the den, The lions overpowered them and broke all their bones into pieces. Okay? So we have no natural reason why Daniel was spared. These lions were obviously hungry, obviously ferocious. Okay? They didn't even make it to the bottom. As they were being dropped in, the lions overpowered them and broke every bone in their body. Okay? No natural reason why Daniel should have been spared. Then King Darius wrote to all the peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in all my royal dominion, people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. So we're going back to Nebuchadnezzar and his first proclamation, the God of Daniel, not of Darius. Okay? Before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be to the end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions. So then Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Okay? So we have what happens at the end of the story. Okay? King Darius makes another proclamation. Okay? And he says, peace be multiplied to you. Now that was a Hebrew greeting. Okay? This is not a normal, typical Persian and Mede greeting. They would not declare peace over their people. And this is a Hebrew greeting. Peace be multiplied to you. And I make a decree that everyone within my dominion, right, all of Babylon and the extended area, you are to tremble in fear before the God of Daniel. Okay? So we see time and time again this pattern through these first 6 chapters. We have God's people being tested and standing firm in their conviction. God honors and protects them. And then there is a testimony of God's works, usually from the ungodly and the Gentiles. Okay? We've had Nebuchadnezzar do it. We've helped Belshazzar do it. Now we've had Darius do it. Okay? Time and time again we see this. This is a pattern that was followed all throughout the book. And this is a pattern that we see in our lives today too. Okay? When God tests us and he brings us through trials and we point back to him, the ungodly can't say anything but, yeah, there's no natural explanation for all of this. It has to be their God, right? Okay? So we need to stand firm in our convictions and honor God even if it costs us something, okay? This could have cost Daniel big, his life. But God has been faithful to him time and time and time and time again, okay? And others see that. They saw that testimony. So everyone wants the faith of Daniel, right? But we just want it without the side of trial, right? God, can I have some faith, but can you leave out the trial part, right? We don't want to go in the lion's den. We don't want to go in the fiery furnace, right? Can I just have the faith part of that, please? Okay? So Daniel had been taken from his home. He was a captive in a foreign land for the majority of his life. Remember, he's a teenager when he comes. He's over 80 now. He's completely stripped of his identity. They changed his name. They changed his knowledge, right? They try to make him Babylonian. He's tested time and time and time and time again. And each time, God found him humble and faithful, okay? Humble and faithful Daniel, after being tested time and time and time again. All right, so next week we are going to jump into chapter 7, and it's interesting that 6:28 tells us that Daniel prospers during the reign. That's okay. Daniel prospers during the reign of Darius and Cyrus. Now he's coming to the end of his life. He's coming to his end in time of Babylon. So for the first 6 chapters, we have everything that happens to Daniel in Babylon. We still have 6 chapters left to go. We're only in the halfway point. Okay, so I'm going to tell you why Daniel does this. There are the last few minutes left. I'm going to teach you a little bit about the way the Hebrews wrote. Okay. This is an incredibly organized book. It seems random, especially once we get into these last 6 chapters. It's going to seem really random, and you're going to go, what in the world is Daniel doing here? The Hebrews would have read this and go, this guy's a genius, okay? It's called a chasm, and there's a double chasm that happens in Daniel. Now, you're probably familiar with the way that song lyrics are constructed, okay? If anybody's studied music, you have the opening, you have a bridge, you have chorus, you have a hook, you have all these different parts, but when you're listening to a song, you're not breaking all of that down in your head. You just know it. You have these expectations when you hear a song, right? So when they would read these historical accounts, they would have these expectations of finding the pattern. Okay, Daniel, where's your pattern? There's a pattern here. Daniel is an absolute genius with his pattern. Okay, and we're going to go over it a little bit to save up for chapter 7. So in chapter 1, okay, we have a historical prologue. Okay, remember we learned everything that happened to Daniel and his people and how they got to Babylon, right? So we have a historical prologue. And then in chapter 2, okay, we have kingdom prophecies, right? That's our image, our golden image, and all the different breakdowns of what's going to happen to the kingdoms, okay? And then in chapter 3, we have our trials, okay? That's the fiery furnace, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? And then in chapter 4, we have the king's prophecy. Okay, this is Nebuchadnezzar. Remember, he has the dream of the tree that gets cut down and he goes and acts like an ox for 7 years. Okay, that's what happens to the king. Well, then in chapter 5, okay, we have another king's prophecy. Okay, the one that we just covered, the handwriting on the wall. Okay, and what happens to Belshazzar. Okay, and then we're going to go out again in chapter 6, which is what we just read. Trials, Daniel in the lion's den. Okay, starting to see the pattern here? Alright, and then in chapter 7, which is what we're going to go over next week, we're going to have kingdom prophecies. Okay, so we see this pattern in Daniel. This is a Hebrew pattern. Okay, so this is the first half, and then we're going to go to the second half. So in chapter 8, we're going to have another kingdom prophecies. Okay, we're going to talk about, this one is going to be wild beasts, and this one's going to be sacrificial animals. Okay, and then chapter 9, like the first part of 9, okay, we're going to have more trials, the trials of God's people. And here is where we start switching back to Hebrew. Okay, remember we talked about how this whole first part is in Aramaic, talking about Babylon. When we start moving towards the second half, we're going to switch over to Hebrew. We're going to talk about the people. So these are trials of God's people, Israel. Okay, and then in the rest of chapter 9, we're going to have another king's prophecy. And we're going to hear that God has declared for Jerusalem to be rebuilt. Okay? And then the third part of 9, 9's a big one when we get there. We're going to have another prophecy concerning the decree to destroy Jerusalem. Okay, when we get there, we're going to go over that one. And then we finally get this big step backwards in chapter 10. We're going to have more trials. Okay, they're going to mourn for their temple that they don't have. And then in chapters 11 and the first part of 12, we're going to have more kingdom prophecies. Okay. And this is going to talk about the north and the south kingdom. Because remember, they were divided. So we're going to give prophecies to both the north and the southern kingdom. And then finally, in the rest of 12, we're going to get a prophetic epilogue. Okay, so you see here, and we actually have two mirroring chasms here. This is how the book of Daniel is set up. It seems really weird to us. It seems so random because once we get here, we're going to take a giant step back in the timeline. Okay, here we're done with Daniel and his reign, his service to Babylon. Okay, that's where we ended. Cyrus is coming. Cyrus is taking over Babylon, and he's going to send people back. Because I love Cyrus. He gets there and he's like, "What's with all these Jews?" Right? He's like, "Why are you doing this, Babylon? Why do you conquer and bring all of them here? Let them go home." He literally tells them, "Let them go home." Okay? This is where we are in the book of Daniel right now. So the next chapter, we're going to take a giant step backwards, and you're going to go, wait a second. What's going on here? Thought we were done. We were at the end. We're only halfway there. Okay? But I want you to see this picture here, this overarching picture that Daniel has, that God is setting up, that his people, when they read the book of Daniel, would have seen all of this and would have understand what Daniel was trying to do. Okay? He was trying to set up these mirrors so that they would see what happened to Daniel in Babylon was a picture of what was going to happen in Jerusalem. Okay? And what is getting ready to happen later, the time of the toes, when we talk about the time of the toes. This is going to be a prophecy of coming and coming. Okay? But before all of that, Daniel paints this picture of what happened to him. Okay? So this is an incredible way that Daniel has organized his book. Okay? He is specifically doing this on purpose so that he can show, look what happened to me. Look what happened to me in Babylon. Look what's going to happen in Jerusalem. And Jerusalem. Okay? It's a great way to organize it, but I don't want you to get tripped up when next week you come in here and we go all the way back to Nebuchadnezzar, right? We're going to go all the way back to the beginning. We're going to show this mirror that Daniel sets up. Okay? I know that's a little confusing, so are there any questions? It's a little bit to take in because we don't have that Hebrew mindset. But you see prophecy after prophecy after prophecy, kingdom prophecy, king prophecy, the trials of our people, right? We're going to talk lots about prophecy in the next 6 chapters. But remember, in the Old Testament, there's a prophecy and a prophecy. Okay? It's always, when you read a prophecy, look for here and look for here. Okay? Because it's always there. You got to look for it.
So the second half's in Hebrew again?
Yes.
Okay.
And about chapter 7, the first couple of 7 is in Aramaic, but the rest of 7 and all the way to the end goes back to Hebrew. Yeah, because we're going to talk about Israel. We talked about Babylon. So when we're here, basically Babylon's done. We're going to talk about Israel now. Okay? So that's why I wanted to kind of show you this shift, because it's going to be really confusing if you think we're still in the time of King Darius and we're still talking about Babylon. We're going to shift to Israel. Any other questions?
Thank you.
You're welcome. Alright, so I am excited to show you guys the second half of Daniel because this is the part that not a whole lot of people explain. They stop here, right? We get through the 70 years of Daniel, we stop. We forget there's this whole other half of the book that then turns around and talks to Israel and talks to God's people. And he basically takes this layer and lays it on top of this layer. He says, now that you've seen everything that's happened to me in Babylon, we're going to show you what's going to happen when we get back to Israel. And then when we get back to Israel. Okay?
So how old is he when we go back in chapter 7?
I think he goes back to Nebuchadnezzar, so we're talking verse 1 says, in the first year of Belshazzar. Okay, so we are going back to Belshazzar. So he is 70s? Yeah.
I thought I read from 58 to 80. Or no, that was his growing point with Nebuchadnezzar and
Right.
Saul and
Yeah, because Nebuchadnezzar reigns for 40 years. So that's our biggest jump, was when we go from Nebuchadnezzar to Belshazzar. That's almost 44 years. Yeah. So we're going to talk about Belshazzar, but we're also going to point back to Nebuchadnezzar. We're going to point back to the beginning. Yeah, as we go along, we're going to see, because he's going to keep pointing back. He's going to be pointing back and pointing back and pointing back. That's why I kind of want to make sure that we understand where we are. Yeah. Yep. Don't you love it? I love Daniel. Daniel's such a good one.
Who picked Daniel? Who was
Well, I think we were talking about Revelation, and we were like, Revelation's kind of scary. And I'm like, well, Daniel wasn't as scary as Revelation.
I think that's exactly what you said.
That's exactly what I said, yeah. It's not as scary as Revelation. It basically speaks over and gives like a big picture, and then Revelation comes behind and like picks up all of these pictures and goes real specific. Daniel kind of gives like this big overarching piece. So it's not as scary. It's still scary, but not as scary. Yeah. Good? Okay. So any questions about Daniel 6 and the lion's den? Did you, anybody have a shift in Daniel? You know, you're thinking some young guy, some, 20 stud muffin, take down lions.
Yeah, I didn't know he was that old.
Yeah, I didn't either.
80-year-old man being dropped in there, right?
Yeah.
And then I don't recall the other end of the story that everybody else had about them.
Yeah. Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we got hard out.
Yeah. We go, yay, Daniel.
Yeah, you're in
and then the king goes, he dumps everybody else in. And like I said, we have no idea, because he realizes these are unfaithful men. They're manipulative, they're twisting. These are not people he wants helping him rule.
Politicians.
Yeah, just and it so encouraged me. I thought, gosh, if we'd have just not strayed from how important integrity and everything was, and just, but God continues to show us that through Scripture.
Yeah.
Just,
And we saw their not being integrity, not having integrity, and what happens to them.
yeah,
They're the ones who end up in the lion's den, and their families.
yeah.
Daniel went in alone. And I'm sure Daniel's been here for a long time. He probably has family, right? We don't know, we're not told. He could have a wife, he could have children, he could have had grandchildren, right? They don't go into the den with him. It's just him. But his enemies, and his enemies' wives, and his enemies' children, these poor little babies, they get thrown into the lion's den because these men did not have integrity. They did not stand up and do what was right. They were malicious, they were twisting, right? They were trying to be self-promoting because they weren't gonna fall in line to somebody who was an exile, who was a slave, They weren't gonna bow down to him. And now they're all gone. And it's Daniel. Daniel's the one left standing at the end of the day.
These are the tricky points, because these are where non-believers or even believers who are struggling really look at, throwing all the families in who are innocent.
Yes.
I was struck by what you said, that that's because they were going with the
Persian
Persian
law.
law.
That was the Persian law. That was not God's
This
law.
wasn't God, smoting them.
Right.
Smoting.
But we still see his judgment. Yeah. Through their hands. It was their law. It wasn't his law at the time.
But these are real sticking points for people who
Yeah.
read.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thankfully in the New Testament, we don't see things like that, but obviously the reflections from a purely, particularly in our modern humanistic society, where good works are really what drive people who are, otherwise righteous.
And trying to get ahead. I mean, that's all they were really trying to do. They were just trying to get ahead. Probably to feed their families, right? But it was the way that they were doing it. They were purposely manipulative. They were trying to take Daniel down. And God wasn't going to stand for that. But he used their own laws to judge them, right? We don't have God smote them. We don't have God knock them off into the edge. God stands back and he goes, this is your law. You're going to be held accountable to your own law. And your law says whole family goes in. Yeah. It's incredible. We see God's mercy and his judgment even through these foreign kings and these foreign policies. Yeah. Not unlike today, God sometimes uses those other things to pass judgment and not necessarily from him. Okay? It's an absolute testimony to history, and that's why it's so important that we bring history into all of this. Because a lot of people would read that and go, why did God kill all those people? And then when you find out that it was the Persian law, the same law that said that the king could not change a decree that he put in the law, was the same decree that said their families had to suffer along with them. Okay? He's like, you want to hold to the law? You're going to hold to the law?